On this podcast, you'll find interviews with high-performing, successful individuals in life sciences. On a weekly basis, we cover their proven methods, principles, strategies, and mindsets to implement new technologies that scale to meet the needs of people in our world.
This episode of Life Science Success is brought to you by 5280 Life Sciences Consulting. If you need help setting your strategy, meeting your operational goals, or are selecting and implementing critical technology in your business, we should talk. Visit 5280lifescience.com to schedule a meeting and find out more.
So today on the podcast, I'd like to welcome Carlos Velez. Welcome, Carlos.
Hi, Don. Thank you for asking me to join you on this podcast.
Glad to do it. Yeah, so can you share a little bit of your background with our listeners?
Sure. I'm Brooklyn born and bred, have an undergrad degree in pharmacy, PhD in pharmaceutical science. Then I have a degree in finance as well. My career has been management consulting, venture capital. Then I worked in business development for 2 specialty pharma companies. Then in 2010, I started a business development consultancy called Lacerta Bio. And I just celebrated my 10th anniversary. I don't know where the time went, but here we are.
Congratulations on that. Yeah.
Well, thank you. And then, so that's my main job. That's how I make my living. And then my side gig is I started an ophthalmology startup called Connexin Therapeutics back in 2018. So I spend the bulk of my time doing the Lacerta Bio business development work, but then I'm also running this startup as well.
Yeah, you seem like a very busy guy. What's it like in terms of trying to find that work-life balance?
I don't know if there's any balance here. I think purely from a time management point of view, what I try to do is I try to treat my ophthalmology startup almost as another client. So I typically divide my time, let's say 3, 4, 5 concurrent clients. And then this part of the time that I need to spend on generating new business for the future and administrative issues and so forth. So I try to squeeze my Connexin work in there just as another client. Sometimes that works well, sometimes it doesn't, but that's the sort of the concept behind how I manage my time.
Very good. And I guess in terms of the startup that you have with Connexin Therapeutics, can you tell me a little bit about what is the overall focus of Connexin and what do you hope to see it grow into?
Sure. Connexin we started in 2018. Actually, we started even earlier than that. And I started it because in my line of work, I meet a lot of biotech CEOs. Some of them are great, really knowledgeable, really eloquent. They know the industry. They know their space really well. But on the other hand, you do meet some that are, quite frankly, they're not there yet. For years, I thought if some of these guys can run a startup, surely I can. And so driven partly by hubris, I started this company. And I started it mainly because the way I got into it in the first place was because I wanted to find something that was at an early stage, but would be something that would be of interest to big pharma at a relatively early stage. So for example, in oncology, you see a lot of transactions where it's just preclinical data. Sometimes it's just a target, but usually it's very little data and big pharma will jump into that. So I wanted to find something like that, but not oncology, because I think oncology is a tough area to just jump into from scratch. And ophthalmology, as it turns out, is one of those areas. Specifically, retinal neuroprotection is an area that's of interest to big pharma. So what we're doing at Connexin is my scientific co-founder has found a mechanism of action where we can block the process by which cells in the retina die in glaucoma. So we're using small molecules to preserve vision in mouse models of glaucoma and also primate models of glaucoma. So in theory, if you have a patient that is already using the prostaglandins, all the other drugs to try to reduce their elevated intraocular pressure, there's a significant number of those patients that are still losing their vision, and they're losing it quite rapidly. So what we would do is we would co-administer our drug to preserve whatever remaining vision they have left. So we have knockout data, we have mouse data, we have primate data with some small molecules. We raised a small seed round in 2019 to do some more chemistry work, do some more animal work, and now we're raising our next round of financing to optimize some of our leads and hopefully bring one of them close to pre-IND studies.
Excellent. And so how have things been with the company, given the fact that we're currently going through COVID? Has it had any effect on what you're doing or no?
Oh, no, absolutely. And it's had two effects. First, from the research point of view, my scientific co-founder, he works at an academic lab in New York. The lab closed in March. So we went 3-4 months without doing any animal work at all. The only thing that they were doing was just basically just taking care of the animals, but no experimental work was being done. So we lost quite a bit of time on the experimental side. From the fundraising side, I was on the road fundraising in January, February timeframe. And I felt very confident at that point that I had closed this next round of financing. But then COVID came along, and investors in the March, April timeframe, a lot of them just stopped investing. They stopped making new investments. They wanted to hang on to cash. Mm-hmm. They wanted to support their existing portfolio companies. Now things are picking up again now. I think first quarter of next year will be much better. But yeah, the spring and summer were really difficult to get investors moving, get them into diligence and so forth. So yeah, it absolutely affected us this year, no question.
Yeah, it's interesting because I've interviewed a few early stage company CEOs, and in the interviews, you can clearly hear the same sort of hesitation and slowdown that they all had to go through as well. But so are you finding that they came out of that now? Are things progressing pretty well now?
Yeah, I think for sure there are investors that are coming out of the. I better be careful what I say here. let's just say that they're becoming a bit more active now than they were over the summer. And look, I don't blame them at all. I think if I were in their shoes, because investors ultimately are managing somebody else's money, if I were in their shoes, I would absolutely take the exact same approach, because who knew what was going to happen? But I think some deals are getting done. And those relationships obviously started before the pandemic. But I think 2021, I think will be a good year for biotech financing in general, especially now that we have vaccines on the touch wood, start seeing some vaccines. I think 2021 will be a reasonably good year.
Yeah. Yeah, let's certainly hope so. And let's also hope that, at least in terms of the other thing that I was hoping that would come out of some of the things that are going on with COVID and the advances in terms of research and things like that, would be that things would be sped up a bit more in terms of their pathway to market as well. Are you hearing anything along those lines, or it still seems to be the same sort of case that you still provide your data and at the same pace the FDA will approve based on patient studies and things?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think while the investment community I think they'll accelerate their activities as we start coming out of the pandemic. What I'm hearing from several of my clients is that the pandemic has caused slowdowns in clinical trial recruitment and clinical trial execution. So there may be quite a number of companies that were planning on having clinical data, let's just say by fourth quarter of this year, but they may not have that data until, I don't know, second quarter next year, third quarter next year. And for a lot of those companies, their next round of financing could be based on the success or failure of some of these trials that were delayed. While I'm optimistic that next year will be good from a financing point of view, I think there will be delays in the timing of some of these investments, simply because a lot of these companies either couldn't finish their clinical studies on time, they couldn't finish their preclinical studies on time. That's the situation we're in. We were delayed in our studies as well, as I mentioned earlier. I think there will be delays. I think it'll be a good year next year, but I think some of the financings and so forth will be delayed because of all this.
Yeah. So if I heard you right in terms of the drug, this would be, you would have to be a glaucoma patient that's pretty late stage in terms of your overall ocular pressure and things like that. And so you're a patient who's coming to that point where your choices are becoming more limited. You're not able to control your pressure as well. Is that correct?
Not exactly. What we're looking for are patients who are rapidly progressive. So if you can imagine vision loss as a slope on a graph, there are some glaucoma patients who are diagnosed, let's say, in their 40s or 50s, and they have very stable disease for decades. So that's not our patient population. Our patient population would be the person who's diagnosed, let's say, in their 50s, and they're losing a lot of their vision. There's some patients who can lose 70, 80% of their vision in 12 to 24 months. They'll be legally blind in at least one eye in that time frame. And then there's another patient population, which is it's called the normotensive glaucoma patients. So these are patients that actually have normal intraocular pressure, but yet they still have glaucoma. And this is a big problem actually in Asia, China, Japan, South Korea. There's a huge problem with normotensive glaucoma. And for those patients, you can try to reduce the you can try to reduce their pressure by using the prostaglandins and so forth, but they already have normal intraocular pressure and they're still losing their vision from glaucoma. So that's another patient population that would be perfect for us as long as they're rapidly progressive. So it's really the slope or the rate at which they're losing their vision is the patient population that we want to target.
And whenever you mention the first case, you mentioned, people maybe in their 50s. Is there any specific age range that this happens, or just it could be any age?
It really could be any age. Obviously, glaucoma is a disease of the aging population, if you will. You're primarily talking about folks late 40s, early 50s, and beyond who are initially diagnosed with glaucoma.
Okay. So in terms of challenges that you've faced this year, you've mentioned some of the things in terms of clinical trials and financing. Any other major challenges for the company as you've tried to work through the process of getting it started?
Yeah, it's a very interesting question because I was talking about this with an investor just the other day, actually. One of the things that I think the pandemic has taught us is that most of us can operate in a virtual setting through Zoom and so forth. It's not always great. It's not always ideal. Yes, the dog and the kids can get in the way. It can work. But one of the things I'm finding is that there are still some investors out there, especially early stage or seed investors, who actually don't feel comfortable investing in a biotech company that's virtual. So when we set up Connexin Therapeutics, we purposely set it up as a virtual company because ophthalmology research is somewhat specialized. So some of the assays that we need, for example, are very specialized. The mouse models of glaucoma, we happen to have one in our labs, in my co-founders' labs, but there are very few CROs who do glaucoma type research, especially in primates. We set this up to be virtual so we can tap into sort of the best and brightest around the world. And even during a pandemic and the lessons that we've learned, there's still some investors who will not invest in a virtual model. They want to see a lab, they want to see desks, they want to see chairs, they want to see pencils. So that's been a surprising challenge in that to try to get some investors out of this habit of thinking that a seed stage company needs direct oversight 24/7, which I don't think is true. I think we can run a virtual pharma company from anywhere. And I think the pandemic has taught us that. So I think that's been another challenge this year, just convincing some investors to think a bit more broadly about the business models that they're investing in or the organizational models that they're investing in.
Yeah, that's an interesting comment. So I interviewed somebody on the podcast by the name of Mona Jahaveri, and she has a company that more or less focuses on startups that are struggling through that valley of death. And the one thing that she said that really strikes home in the comment that I just heard you say is that she said, think about GoFundMe for drugs. If you could turn the model upside down and say, hey, look, rather than going to these type of people to go and fund your development, maybe you're going to something else where people that really care about the outcome, that truly care about maybe glaucoma as a treatment, might be a better sort of investment. But I hear that same kind of tone whenever I hear you describe, hey, look, some people really want to see furniture and
right.
but truthfully, that's sunk cost that if you can find it in other ways, it makes a lot of sense to try and do it in other ways as well.
Yeah, precisely. I feel the same way about other businesses, like consulting, for example. Yes, you can hire a firm that has a nice fancy office on Fifth Avenue in New York City, but recognize that the cost of that from that mahogany lining on the walls, that expense has to come from somewhere.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. So what about goals for 2021? As you look into the future, what are you thinking 2021 does for the company next?
I'm very optimistic. This year has been a struggle. There's no denying that. And again, like I said earlier, I don't blame investors for putting the brakes on things this year. But I think next year, let's be frank, that the money's got to go somewhere. So I think it'll be a good year for biotech in general. I'm reasonably optimistic that we'll close this round and get things moving. It'll be a year later than I had hoped. As long as it gets moving, then it's all good.
Yeah, and I think a lot of us are looking at 2021 saying, hey, there will be a vaccine that's administered to a larger portion of the population. For sure, hopefully we come out of this looking much better. The one thing I keep trying to remind people is that even though we have a flu vaccine, we still get the flu. So it's not like it's entirely going away.
Exactly.
Yeah, so this idea of continuing to see the benefits maybe of being virtual, but also having a little bit more flexibility of not. I personally have been working out of my home for, more than 6 months, and I have really almost no reason to leave because most of the things I can do right from here. And that's great. But at the same time, I do look forward to getting out and being with people again. Do you think not having that social interaction at all affects this process at all?
I think it does. And we were talking about this. I'm a member of a small group of friends, and during the pandemic, we've been having these Zoom meetings once a week. And this is an issue that actually comes up quite often. And in my view, yeah, absolutely, it makes a difference, because ultimately, when you're having a relationship with an investor, it really is like a marriage. It should be a long-term win-win relationship where they're providing you not only with just a check, but they're providing you with advice, connections, and so forth. And so having that personal relationship with an investor, I think it's really important. And I'm not sure you can do that over Zoom, no matter how many times you meet over Zoom. So yeah, I think being able to get back and have face-to-face meetings, I think is going to be really an important part towards driving investments in biotech. So I think, like I said earlier, I think if we're still in this sort of relative work from home situation for the first 3, 4, 5, 6 months of next year, I think that'll cause some delays in some of the investments. But once we start meeting face to face again, maybe summer, fall, then I think things will pick up, and it'll be because of this, because of the renewed ability to have these face to face personal interactions.
Yeah. Yeah. And again, to circle back on the patient side, whenever you do get to clinical trials and things like that, I know I've talked to people in the CRO space and they're saying, hey, look, there's a definite struggle in terms of bringing patients in, getting people to be comfortable enough to come in and things like that. And like you said, in your area, maybe the CRO space and getting patients in is a little more stringent because of some of the things that you're having to work through as well. It's going to be a challenge for sure.
Yep.
So we're at the point in the podcast where I like to ask the same 3 questions of every guest. What inspires you?
What inspires me? That's a really good question. I've been in pharma since I was making deliveries for a local pharmacy when I was in high school. It's the only industry that I know. And so for me to, just try my hand at actually starting a pharma company and seeing something move through the mice, through the primates. I mean, it's just, for me, it's just personally just very, very exciting. It's something that I've wanted to do this for a long time, and it finally just all came and fell together. Call it ambition, call it hubris, call it what you will, but I think it's just something that's really exciting. It's very interesting. And if we can raise this round and get that moving, I'll be really happy.
Yeah, I had the benefit of interviewing a few serial entrepreneurs, in this space. And it does sound exciting, right? It does sound like a great adventure to get to the kind of experience. But then also when you think about the sort of the output and what the impact that you can have on patients on their real life, it just sounds amazing.
There's no question. In our case, we're talking about preserving vision. We're talking about potentially saving somebody from losing their eyesight. And obviously it's early. We don't know, how effective these drugs will be. We don't know if we'll be saving vision for the rest of the patient's life, or if it's just a temporary thing. We don't know. But gosh, there are millions of people are losing their eyesight due to glaucoma. And we actually have a backup program where it's a similar mechanism of action, but it's actually for patients that lose their vision who have diabetic retinopathy, which is another big problem. If we're talking about preventing blindness, I don't know if something like that doesn't excite you, then you're in the wrong line of work.
Exactly. What concerns you?
Fundraising. Ask any biotech CEO, they'll tell you the same thing. It's fundraising. Like I said earlier, I'm optimistic. I think we'll come out of this, especially second half of next year. I think you will see a lot of funds flowing into biotech, maybe from some unexpected places. But one thing that does concern me is that if you look at the industry as a whole over the past maybe 10, 15, 20 years, the industry, especially big pharma, has really narrowed their focus in terms of the therapeutic areas that they work on: oncology, rare diseases, gene therapy, cellular therapies, and so forth. And that's great. There's nothing wrong with that. But that's coming at the expense of other therapeutic areas that perhaps are being underinvested. So antibiotics, antivirals. Boy, do we need new antivirals and new antibiotics. Because if you think this pandemic is bad, wait till the next one comes along. We need better ways to treat Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, depression, pain. We really need solid drugs to treat chronic pain that are non-opioids. So there are a lot of these areas where, when I first started in the 80s, lots of companies were developing new pain drugs, but that's all gone. And to answer your question, what concerns me is that this trend is going to continue, that the industry is going to continue to focus more and more narrowly. Investors are going to follow suit, and we're going to wind up with just tremendous amounts of unmet medical need and no research dollars going to tackle those problems. I got into ophthalmology because I knew that's an area that pharma would be interested in. But frankly, there are lots of other medical conditions that are just not being tackled at this point. And to me, that's a concern for sure.
Yeah, and it definitely sounds, from the calls that I get, at least in terms of people that are focused much more on hedge funds and things like that, they typically want to know more about AI in this space. They want to know about personalized medicine and next generation sequencing, a little bit on the CRISPR side. Those are typically the areas that they're focusing right now, at least most of that side of the investment. And that's not even to talk about the business development and the folks that are really investing in the developments themselves. So, yeah.
Right.
I understand. Right. So what excites you?
Oh, gosh. I think it's to repeat what I said earlier. I think from a startup point of view, we've got really good data. We've got a really solid business plan. If we close the round, we can generate data relatively quickly. We're tapping into some great expertise, a very specialized expertise, very expensive expertise, but you got to do what you got to do. And we have mouse models and primate models and labs. So we have all the pieces in place. And if we can close this round, we're going to be moving very quickly. We were already virtual before the pandemic. We'll still continue working virtually. And yeah, it'll be great once we get this thing going.
Excellent. Carlos, Velez, thank you so much for being on the podcast. I greatly appreciate you joining me. And it was very interesting for me to get to hear this side of things. I've interviewed a lot of people on the sort of cancer side and then antimicrobials and artificial intelligence and those things. Now to hear a little bit more about what's going on in the eye, I greatly appreciated your story. So thank you so much.
Thank you for the invitation, Don. I really enjoyed it. It was a lot of fun. Thank you very much.
Thank you for listening to Life Science Success. For complete details about this podcast, including show notes, how to get in touch with guests, and more episodes, please visit www.lifesciencesuccess.com. If there's someone you'd like for us to invite to the show as a guest, please let me know by sending me a message at the podcast website. Please click subscribe on your favorite podcast app, share the podcast, or tell a friend about it. And last but not least, rate the podcast. Thank you again.